We reject the ideology of globalism, and we embrace the doctrine of patriotism.
Not only will this tax plan pay for itself, but it will pay down debt.
There are moral and legal obligation questions that I think we'll have to wrestle with as a society.
When we as people go wobbly on the truth, we go wobbly on America.
All you have to do is look at the numbers, look at what we've done.
And this is all in the beginning.
From 100.9 FM WXIR, this is Evidence of Design, and I'm your host, Jason Taylor. Evidence of Design is a live talk show about the political economy. We critique income and wealth inequality and support democratic values. Thank you for listening, and welcome. Good morning, everyone. You're listening to 100.9 FM WXIR in Rochester. This is Evidence of Design. I'm your host, Jason Taylor, and I'm joined by my good friends and co-hosts, Matt Treadwell.
Hello.
And Mary Lawrence.
Good morning.
On this show, we critique income and wealth inequality, support democratic values, and social justice. There is not enough research and attention that's given to economic inequality. That is our opinion on this show, and then we try to raise awareness about where economic inequality comes from, what effects it has, and what we can do to change things for the better. We believe that if we actually understand why there's economic inequality, and if we actually affect policy changes that make it so that we have a more economically equal society, a lot of other issues as well will be solved, or at least alleviated to some extent. And so we try to foreground economic inequality. On today's show, we'll be focusing on education. So we'll be talking about educational funding this hour. We'll be talking about educational funding disparities. And we'll be talking about sort of the trends in educational funding over at least, we'll have a broader look, but especially the past decade, and also why there were so many teacher strikes as a result of low educational funding. We especially saw that in 2018, last year, when there was a lot of teacher strikes going on throughout the country. So we'll be talking about educational funding this hour. It is a very important and interesting topic. The more I delve into learning about educational funding, the more kind of confused I get, but the more hungry I get at the same time to sort of figure it out. There's a lot to it, so we'll have a very tight hour. Despite that, we want to hear from you. That's what we're about at WXIR. We have the privilege and the blessing of being a grassroots local community radio show, and that means we're all volunteers here, and we want to hear from you as a community member as well, because that's what we're about. You can let us know what you're thinking, 585-219-8889. We are live for you on the 14th of December, so 585-219-8889. Give us a call or email us at radioeod@gmail.com. We're also on Facebook and Twitter at the Radio EOD handle. Lots of ways to get in touch with us. Again, we're talking about educational funding this hour. We're going to get into a ton of stuff. We'd love to hear from you. We ready to take it away, folks?
So ready.
Let's do it. Tracy Chapman with Talking About a Revolution. And this is Evidence of Design on 100.9 FM WXIR in Rochester, New York. Let's start talking about educational funding this hour. We have a lot to get into. So I don't know how much you know, Matt or Mary, about educational funding, but my guess is that not a whole lot. No offense, I don't know a whole lot either, and I've studied this for my master's degree in teaching and curriculum, and I there's a lot more I want to know, and I'm guessing a lot of community members out there might not know a whole bunch either. Besides, education's funded through taxes, and maybe the state's involved. And wait a second, does the federal government fund education at all? It must be all of my taxes, or something like that. There's just a whole lot to it.
Yeah, I know we spoke with Eamon Scanlon, the education policy analyst, a few weeks ago, and I learned really a lot when we were talking about how budgets are made and how the deficit came to be in the RCSD right now. But yeah, I did learn a lot from that conversation. I think it also showed that there's a lot more to learn and kind of a lot of gray area within it.
Yeah, so we'll start this hour by talking about sort of the basics of educational funding and where money comes from for education. Then we'll talk about how in New York State, actually the state government has not been funding education across the state according to what it should be. And there's actually billions of dollars that the New York State has not funded schools to. And that's been sort of revealed in various reporting recently, especially by an organization called the Alliance for Quality Education. So first piece, we're talking about how is education funded. Second piece, we're talking about how the state has underfunded education across New York State. And then the third piece that we'll be doing is playing a clip actually from Reclaiming the Narrative. That is WXIR's local news show, mainly produced and hosted by Darian Lehman, but also a few other folks. And we'll be playing a clip that Darian aired yesterday. It's on Fridays at 12, and also I believe this morning, Saturday morning at 7:30, we'll be airing a clip from Darian, who interviewed an education sort of expert from Massachusetts. And lastly, Mary will be talking about teacher strikes and why teachers have went on strike around the country, especially last year, and also how that's related to the underfunding of education, especially from the global financial crisis in 2008. So let's start right now on talking about how education is funded. And it's important to note that in the U.S. Constitution, the Constitution doesn't mention education at all. So actually, the Constitution does not prescribe education as a right to any American. Over time, education kind of became a right as a states' rights thing, and in the early 1900s, that's when we see kind of compulsory education across the entire United States. So that's why we have public schools, and that's why it is illegal not to go to public schools unless you have sort of, a signature to say you can be homeschooled or something. Mm-hmm. And so,
which I think is actually just an interesting note to bring up. That is pretty unique to the United States. There are, at least where I've taught in Europe, it's actually not allowed to homeschool your children. So that is something that's, still kind of an interesting quirk of our country. Yeah,
and there's a lot of value to having a compulsory public education, I think, right? In theory, public education is a great equalizer. Everyone, regardless of race, class, gender, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, will attend the same public school system. Of course, in practice, that doesn't really equate out that way for a number of reasons, particularly segregation and also, of course, inequalities within those sectors like socioeconomics and race. But, in theory, public education is the great democratic equalizer, in theory. And I think that's a good thing, and we should get behind that stuff. So because education is not mentioned in the Constitution, the 10th Amendment of our Constitution says, hey, if the Constitution doesn't specify it, then the states have the authority over it. And that's why education is profoundly a state and local issue, for the most part. So how schools are funded nowadays, according to the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, 47% of all funding to education across the entire United States comes from state governments. So 47% of funding comes from the state, 45% comes from localities, and then 8% comes from the federal government. So most of the funding to education, the majority minority, comes from state funding formulas, essentially. And that's what we'll be talking about in the second part of our hour, talking about how the New York State government has underfunded education. They've underfunded various schools and districts because they're not adhering to their state funding formula. Which matters because, again, most of the funding to schools, at least across the country, comes from the state governments. The 45% of educational funding that comes from localities, that's really important because most of that comes from property taxes. And we know that the school districts are highly segregated in the United States. They're highly segregated based on racial grounds. And also, most importantly, school districts are highly segregated based on socioeconomic grounds. So if local funding for schools comes from property taxes and schools are segregated, the types of inequalities that you see in the housing market will directly transfer into the school system and the educational system. And we see that in Rochester, we see that in New York State, we see that across the country. If you live in a wealthier neighborhood, in a wealthier school district, you will have more taxes to fund your schools in a better way. Students who go to the schools tend to get a higher quality education. They'll tend to want to live in those neighborhoods again, and they'll have more money from better jobs to spend on their educational system. And so it creates this feedback cycle. And the same can be said in a negative way of poorer areas and poorer districts. So that is a very important piece to critique or pay attention to for local funding sources. And lastly, a very small minority of funding for schools and education in the K-12 system comes from the federal government. And, a good example of this is Title I funding, which is basically funding that the federal government set up in 1965, President Johnson, the war on poverty, to help schools with poor and under sort of funded students. So Title I funding will have federal dollars go to schools with a lot of poor students.
Was that new in 1965? Was there
Yes.
previously any federal funding for public education?
There was a little bit. So there's a great debate that goes on in America. We see this a lot, like Rick Perry, for instance, the current Secretary of Energy and the gentleman who's stepping down thanks to this whole Ukraine conflict, the Ukraine scandal. So Rick Perry's famously always sort of decried against the education department, says that he wants it abolished. The current education secretary, Betsy DeVos, wants a small education department. So Republicans in general do not like the education department. They think that the federal government should have as little a role as possible in the educational system. Again, it's not in the Constitution. Again, it should be up to states' rights or local rights. So Republicans tend to not like the education department. So, Mary, where I'm going with this is that in 1965, this was the largest incursion of the federal government into our educational system. It was the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, and that has been reauthorized a number of times as the No Child Left Behind Act. We've heard of that in 2001 under the Bush administration, and also most recently in 2015, the Every Student Succeeds Act with the Obama administration. And that is our current sort of federal educational statute or standard that we're living under now. And so, yes, there's always been a small federal government involvement in education, but that increased in 1965 with Lyndon Johnson. And you can argue, depending on which political side you're on, whether or not the federal government has too large or too small of a role in the educational system today. But 1965 is really where the modern federal involvement in education starts.
With Johnson?
With Johnson, yep. And because, the Great Society, the transformation, civil rights. So Johnson, the Johnson period in American history is quite important. Equally as important on the pendulum scale as Reagan, I would argue. But so here we are, just to remind folks, in general, according to the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, educational funding across the United States, 47% comes from states and their funding formulas, 45% comes from localities and property taxes, and 8% comes from the federal government through various programs such as Title I. And that's kind of, in general, how educational funding looks, but it's very complicated because, again, we have 50 states, meaning we basically have 50 different educational systems that are funded in different ways. So it is quite confusing. And it's worth pointing out, because we have 50 different states, we have interstate, interdistrict, and intra-district funding disparities. So what you call adequate or equitable or equal educational funding, that's up for debate. And that's kind of what we'll be talking about this hour. Yes, Mary.
I'm just wondering what you, if you can break that down a little bit. You said, so it was interstate, interdistrict,
Yep.
and intra-district.
Yeah.
Can you break that down and explain that a little bit more as to what that means?
Sure. So there's interstate funding disparities, meaning states spend different amounts on education. So New York State, we spend the most per pupil, per student on education than any other state in the country. New York State spends on average around $22,000 per student in education.
Per year?
Per year. Yep. You can compare that to a state like Utah, which spends, I believe, like $11,000 or something per student per year. So that's an interstate funding disparity, where New York State spends more per student on education. You can argue whether or not that's good or bad, right? There are reasons why New York State would spend more and Utah would spend less, et cetera, et cetera. But that's an interstate funding disparity. Sure. There's also an interdistrict funding disparity. So, for example, the Rochester City School District might spend more on its students than the Pittsford School District, or something like that. So you can have different disparities between school districts that are within the state, and then you can have funding disparities between schools within the same district.
And how does that work?
Well, the school district would have a budget, and the school district would decide which schools would get which funding.
Oh, okay.
So, for example, in, let's say, the Webster Central School District, Thomas High School could receive different amounts of money than Webster Schroeder High School. And you can look at the same thing in RCSD, where Edison Tech would get a different amount of funding than Wilson Academy or something like that.
Okay.
And so I'm sort of being general here because I'm just trying to say, like, you can have funding disparities in different ways depending on what you define as a disparity. You know?
And that's when we're talking about this disparity, we're talking strictly about state funding and not the other parts of funding, right?
No,
or just in general?
I'm just talking in general.
Okay.
Yeah. So in the soup that is made up of state, local, and federal, the resultant dollar amount is different.
Gotcha.
Yeah, because of that soup makeup and mixture. So, yeah. So listeners, we're talking about educational funding this hour. We're trying to provide a little bit of context or background about how schools get funded. Then we're looking at how the New York State Education Department has been underfunding schools. We'll be hearing from Darian Lehman on another WXIR show called Reclaiming the Narrative and his interview this week with a educational sort of expert from Massachusetts. And lastly, Mary will be talking about teacher strikes. So we have a lot to get through this hour, but I want to remind you to get in touch with us. Don't worry about interrupting us at 585-219-8889. Again, that's 585-219-8889. So what's important also to note, and we talked about this at the top of the hour, is that educational funding across the United States has been essentially flat, for the most part, in many states at least, since the Great Recession.
In 2008.
In 2008, right. So the Great Recession hit, and you actually saw in a lot of states, especially southern states, they were funding their schools at less of an amount in like 2015 than they were funding them in like 2008. So that is very important to keep in mind when we're talking about funding of education and how it also changes over time. And a lot of those reasons for those red states in particular that weren't funding education to what a lot of people would describe as a minimally adequate standard, you saw a lot of teacher strikes and revolts in that regard. And so it's important to keep in mind, too, the larger economic context. And so while now on a national average, we spend a U.S. annual per pupil expenditure of $12,000 per student per year, that is still roughly flattish since the Great Recession. So if the U.S. average is $12,000 per student per year, the New York State average, again, is around $22,000 per student per year. Bless you, Matt. And the RCSD average is $27,000 per student per year. So RCSD spends around 2.5 times the amount per student per year than the U.S. average.
And just slightly above the New York State average.
Correct. Yep. So just a lot of context to keep in mind there. And now I want to sort of there's so much to get through, so let's sort of speed this up a little bit. But there's an important point when we're talking about educational funding, and we're talking about what is fair. What is equitable? What is equal? So there's a difference between equitable and equal, and I think we all know that. Equal is the same dollar amount. Equitable is what someone deserves or what's right, and those two things are different. And equitable can be a political thing, so we have to politically decide what equitable means. And in New York State, the New York State Constitution guarantees every student a right to a sound, basic education. That's the wording. In New York State, you are guaranteed a right to a sound, basic education. The question becomes, though, what does that mean? What is a sound, basic education? And what dollar amounts equals a sound, basic education? That's been litigated in courts. It's been litigated in the legislative branches, and that's what's up for question here. I have a lot more to get into that. Mary, do you have a point on that? Or?
Yeah, well, I'm just thinking along those terms. You know, you brought up these different averages of, you know, how much states on average pay per student per student per year, and what the RCSD spends is obviously vastly more than the national average. And I don't know what, you know, how that differs from state to state. The national average is obviously like very widespread. But just thinking about, you know, that connection with what you were saying earlier with the disparity between districts, and maybe districts that have districts where the population is wealthier are going to have more funding from their taxes because they have higher property taxes, because they have maybe larger properties, their properties are more expensive. And in a district like the RCSD, where the population generally doesn't have, like, they won't be able to generate as much with property taxes. So there needs to be some way to make up that difference to provide each of those students, as you say, an equitable education. And I think that it is, to me, it's obvious that when you have a district with a less wealthy population, then the state has to pay more because the state has said we're going to provide a basic and sound education. Yeah. So to me, no matter where that funding comes from, in the end, you have to be able to offer the same quality education. I don't know that that's happening. But in theory, you should be able to. And if that means that in less wealthy districts, the state has to pay more, then that's what it should do.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I think that's how and why you see the RCSD have some money to spend on students because of state funding and also federal funding. It still receives, property tax funding. It is slightly different with New York State because we have property tax caps and things like that. And so, again, very messy conversations. But, Mary, you talking through this to say, like, yeah, if you are a poorer neighborhood or district, you're going to have less property taxes. You need to make up that money somehow. And so if it's not coming from localities, it's going to have to come from state or federal. And
to that point, just to sort of illustrate this more, again, the U.S. average amount spent per student is what, around $11,000? $12,000. Yeah. And the U.S. average, or the U.S. median income per household is $53,482 a year. Mm-hmm. And where we're looking at the RCSD, which is paying, where the state is paying, or where the amount spent per student is $27,000, the average median, or the median household income is around $30,000. So it's, there is a big difference there, and there's a big difference in how much is spent, and to me that fits. Right. I think it makes a lot of sense. Yeah. And I want to preface this whole thing here, why we're talking about numbers and whatnot. So me personally, politically, I don't think it's a great idea to debate educational funding based on dollar values. Like, how much is a student's education worth? I personally don't think it's worth us spending too much time to commodify a student's education, right? Education needs to be whatever it costs to allow a student to be successful and positively contribute to our civil society and be a productive human being in the way that they define productivity. And so in talking about all these numbers here, I think, Mary, we're laying this out just to lay out a foundation and a context. But if someone were to answer back or critique, and if we had time for debate here, I would say, look, all these numbers, the conversation needs to go just beyond the numbers too, to say, like, whatever it costs to fund a student to be successful, that's what it is. Mm-hmm. If we're talking about high needs, racially segregated and economically segregated district that needs a lot more funding for students to be successful, then to me that's fine. Whatever Certainly. It takes to be a student to be successful. And if you're mad at how much money is spent on education for a student, then maybe do some work in the community. Right. Then maybe you should instead be mad at the fact that these students are growing up in poverty. That's not their fault. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of what I would argue. And I'm hoping that if you're listening to us talk about all these numbers, then you're getting angry, then, I'm angry with you. It's sort of talking about some of these things. But I'm looking at the time here, and so let's sort of end the first very most basic 101 intro of how schools are funded from states and localities and federal sources. And let's talk about how New York State has been underfunding schools across the entire state for over the past decade. So this information that I'm about to talk about here comes from the Alliance for Quality Education. They're, at least in New York, they spent a lot of work recently investigating for quite some time, actually, funding levels from the state government into schools. And as mentioned, across the United States, on average, 47% of school funding comes from states. So states make up the highest proportion of funding sources for education. And so if states aren't funding schools according to what they should be, that it has a dramatic impact on the quality of education and the ability for schools to meet their budgets. And so for the state education, or for in New York State, we have something called the Foundation Aid Formula.
This came about of a sort of a landmark case in New York called the Campaign for Fiscal Equity versus State of New York. There's been a number of court cases with that same name over time because it's been relitigated in a number of different ways. And basically, there are different ways for people to bring suit against New York to say our schools aren't being funded adequately. In 2006 especially, and the 2003 cases for Campaign for Fiscal Equity versus State of New York, the suit brought against New York State was that, again, our students are not being funded adequately for education, and so it went to the highest the highest court in New York, the New York State Court of Appeals, and the sort of result of that case was that, look, the judicial branch is saying the legislative branch has to figure out how to meet a sound basic education for students' education. This must include three things. We must determine the actual cost of providing a sound basic education. So what is a dollar amount on that? How can we reform the school funding system to ensure all schools have the funding necessary to provide a sound basic education? And lastly, how can we develop a system of accountability to ensure that we are providing a sound basic education? So basically the court said we got to figure out what it costs, we got to figure out how to fund it, and then we got to figure out how to make sure that we're accountable to it. And as a result, New York State came up with the foundation aid formula in 2007. That is the formula that the state is supposed to be using to fund districts.
And again, that is the formula that the state created for itself.
That is the state-created formula, and that formula looks something like this. What is the average cost of a student in New York State to educate them in K-12? What is the regional cost index? So what are the differences of living and cost of living around parts of New York? What are the cost of student needs, such as special education, the number of students living in poverty, the number of students receiving free or reduced lunch, the number of English language learners? So what is all that added together, all of those costs, minus the expected local contribution, which again, that's tagging in the local sources of educational funding based on local income and property wealth. So if you add up all those costs, and if you subtract the expected local contribution, that's how you get the foundation aid formula for what states should be giving each district. It is very complex. Anyone who's looked at these formulas or studied them will tell you the same. By God, educational funding is insane. It is very complex, and it makes me hungry and thirsty to learn more about it. So long story short, the state came up with this formula. They funded districts according to this for, I think, at least 1 year, and it increased funding for that year by a lot. And then the state hasn't really been adhering to the formula. Instead, the governor's office and the legislature has been using different funding formulas. They've essentially just not adhered to their own foundation aid formula, and have just been coming up with a different formula to fund states, to fund the education in a haphazard way. This is all according to Alliance for Quality Education. They have a report online called the Foundation Aid in Name Only, and the report basically concludes that the state of New York owes schools $4 billion in foundation aid. And 67% of that $4 billion would go to school districts where more than half of its students are black and brown. And this report by the Alliance for Quality Education does not mince words. And it says that the state's failure to adhere to its own foundation aid formula to fund schools equal to a sound basic education that they themselves determined is equivalent to educational racism. And it undermines or under-resources schools with majority black and brown students. They do not mince words there. Educational racism. And so this is an issue that a lot of folks may not know about. Hasn't really received a whole lot of press, I think in part because it's so complicated. But if the Alliance for Quality Education is to believe, and other press reports are to believe, which I believe their work, then the state has not been funding schools.
And where can our listeners find this report if they're interested in reading more? Do you have a link or a...
Yeah, as Matt knows, I would always say Google it. So if you Google AQE Foundation Aid, that's Alliance for Quality Education, AQE, that'll come up for you. So Google Alliance for Quality Education or something like New York State Foundation Aid, that'll come up. Foundation Aid in Name Only is the name of the report. And this has been corroborated by other sources too. It's not like this is just one organization studying this thing. Yeah, so it's It's worth looking up. It's a fairly short report. It's only 15 pages, so that's doable. Anyone read the Mueller report yet?
Well, most of it's blacked out. So
yeah, no, I'm just kidding. That doesn't matter how long it is. If it's worth reading, it's worth reading, right? So I think I'm going to wrap up that piece there. Though we've heard a lot of Jason talking this hour, and I hope that
in a half hour.
yeah, and I hope that where we're at in our conversation, I hope that we're feeling sort of comfortable knowing a little bit more about educational funding, how there's interstate disparities, there's intradistrict disparities, and there are interdistrict disparities, and it all depends on what you define as adequate or basic or equitable or equal education. We talked about my own political belief, where it's very hard to put a dollar value on education. And what most matters to me is that we spend whatever we need to allow students to be successful. And if students are suffering from societal segregation or racism or low-income neighborhoods and households, then we need to spend more money on their education. And I think that's a normal thing, because society isn't meeting their needs. Then we got to do something about it. For compulsory public education is the great equalizer, right? We've also just learned that New York State has been not adhering to its own foundation aid formula, which is supposed to be the statewide formula to fund education. And we've learned that that's been going on for over a decade now, where the state has essentially failed to adhere to its own formula. And they've instead been funding schools to a different amount. And so right now, schools across the state are owed $4 billion in educational funding.
Yeah. That is certainly a lot. So let's switch gears here really quickly. We are going to replay a clip that was played yesterday on local news show Reclaiming the Narrative, which also plays on WXIR. It plays every Friday at noon and is hosted by Darian Lehman, and usually a guest or an additional host as well. Yesterday, Darian had an interview with the former head of Massachusetts Teachers Union, Barbara Mataloni. They only played a 7-minute clip of the interview yesterday. We are going to play the full 12-minute interview so that you can have a little bit more of the details and the context. We have an hour-long show. They only have a half hour, so we are able to play a little bit more. So we're going to play the full 12-minute interview for you. So without further ado, this is Reclaiming the Narrative, Darian Lehman with Barbara Mataloni. And you're listening to Evidence of Design on 100.9 FM WXIR.
Barbara Mataloni is the former president.
Oh, wait.
I had dreams.
Jason is messing up with the computer. Matt, fire me. All right, let's try this one more time. So this is Darian Lehman, Reclaiming the Narrative, 100.9 FM WXIR. This is a 12-minute clip, so stay tuned. This is worth listening to, I think.
Of the Massachusetts Teachers Association. She was elected in 2014 as part of a broader grassroots mobilization among teachers in Massachusetts. She's also on staff at Labor Notes, and earlier this fall she published an article there entitled Defying Injunction, Massachusetts Teachers Strike. The piece describes how public school teachers in the Boston suburb of Dedham decided to go out on strike for better working conditions, even though Massachusetts state law prohibits it. Well, to talk more about this and other labor news, Barbara Mataloni joins us now by phone. Barbara, welcome to Reclaiming the Narrative. Thanks for joining us. First off, can you give listeners here in Rochester some context for the Dedham teachers strike that took place this October? You know, people might be familiar with the Red for Ed movement that swept southern and western states back in 2018. But how did this one local union in Massachusetts get to the point where they were willing to vote almost unanimously to take action that could have consequences of fines and even jail time?
Yeah, thanks. I think it's important to understand that even though we're in supposedly a blue state here in Massachusetts, I would contest that I do think the Dedham strike is an outgrowth in part of the Red for Ed movement, in the sense that watching the teacher strikes across the country has inspired educators everywhere I go, union members everywhere I go. In Dedham, they were 2 years into no contract, and they were organizing for the last 10 months to say, if we're not able to get the district to the table, we're going to go out on strike. And they actually named that 10 months ago, that they were going to move for a strike. They were striking in particular around working conditions, demands from the district for more hours worked without increasing compensation. Interestingly, also, they were striking around sexual harassment issues where they wanted to be able to file grievances relative to sexual harassment. And I think the thing that's moving to me about that strike is the degree to which the teachers organized themselves under really excellent leadership from their president, Tim Dwyer, and accessed their solidarity over a series of actions to take what was a really scary step. Striking, as you noted, is illegal in Massachusetts, but they walked each step together until they got to the place where they were ready to walk over the line into a strike. And I think they did a remarkable job sort of preparing themselves for that.
Mm-hmm. Would you say that the Dedham teachers had the support of the statewide union in making that decision?
That's a great question. I would say absolutely, although, it is a complicated line for the statewide union to walk there because to the degree that they directly and explicitly supported the strike, they would themselves be subject to injunctions. But I do think that, what we saw happen in terms of the statewide support was that members in other unions supported Dedham. And while the elected leadership, which is a very progressive leadership, could not themselves say the word strike, they made it clear that the Dedham teachers had absolutely reasonable demands and had every reason to be outraged. And then we were able to bring together hundreds and hundreds of educators from other locals to say, we support you. We as individual educators are here because we support that strike.
Now, there's a saying on the left that there are no illegal strikes, only successful and unsuccessful strikes. Can you talk about what the outcome of that action has been and whether, in fact, any legal action appears to be pending against teachers who took the strike action?
Yeah, the short answer is they won everything. And they won everything within 72 hours. They took the strike vote on a Thursday and had overwhelming support for the strike from the membership. They walked out on Friday. And the idea there was, we're not going to give you any time to file an injunction and slow us down. They were out on Friday. They had a rally on Saturday. And by Sunday, the district said, okay, we'll come back to the table and we'll talk to you. And they won everything. They had no extra professional development days that they weren't going to be compensated for. They got grievance procedures around sexual harassment. They got the salary increases that they wanted. And they did that within the context of, it's my understanding, a very minimal fee that the union was going to pay relative to monies that the district had to spend for the cafeteria on the Friday that school was missed. They did file injunctions against the president of the union and the local, and the president personally, not just as the president. Nothing came of any of that. So, yeah, no illegal strikes, only unsuccessful strikes, and this was an astonishingly successful strike.
Now, you have been part of a major shift in organizing culture within the Massachusetts Teachers Association. Can you imagine this having happened 10 years ago? And if not, what has shifted?
Yeah, actually the last strike in Massachusetts was, I think, 12 years ago in the city of Quincy. Once people walk, it's very difficult, even for leadership, to not support it, right? We saw that happen in West Virginia. We saw that happen in Arizona and Oklahoma. The rank and file organized themselves. They said, we're going out, and the leadership said, oh, yeah, let us go and get out in front with you. But I think that, the difference that we see was the degree to which the support from the other locals came out. And a lot of that support, honestly, came from Educators for Democratic Union, which is the caucus that I was elected out of and that our current leadership is elected out of, and that the president of Dedham was a part of as well. So that we have been building a rank and file organizing sensibility. We won a big ballot question in 2016 when we shut down the charter industry that tried to raise the cap on charters here in Massachusetts. That gave educators a sense of their power and their value to the community. And we're now seeing that really bubble up in lots of locals. I mean, just this morning on my Facebook feed, the number of locals within Massachusetts where we see members organizing to push back against bullying principals, to demand a living wage for our paraprofessionals. It's remarkable. There's just so much activity happening.
Now, I also wanted to ask for your thoughts on the school funding law that the governor of Massachusetts signed in late November. The Student Opportunity Act commits the state to an additional $1.5 billion in annual school funding in an effort to achieve equitably funded schools over the next 7 years. And among other things, the new law includes reimbursements for extraordinary special ed costs and for charter tuition. And I pull those out because those are also issues here in the Rochester City School District where the $30 million budget gap that the district is facing, part of that at least was attributed to special ed, extraordinary costs, charter tuition, among other things, as well as New York State's failure to adequately fund the foundation aid that they had promised back in 2007. So, with that as our listeners' context, can you talk about what the significance of the new Massachusetts state law is from your perspective, and what role the teachers union has played in pushing for some of these provisions?
Yeah. It's remarkable. What this is going to mean, there are local districts, Springfield just down the road from where I live. We're talking upwards of $91 million more a year coming into the district in districts that really need it. And it is going to, in particular, bring necessary, long-needed funds into districts that have the highest need. Our ability to win this came from our charter fight back in 2016 when we beat back the attempt to raise the cap on charters. In that struggle and that campaign, we were able to raise the issue of underfunding public schools. And we won that battle because people were like, well, charter schools are taking money away from public schools. We want fully funded public schools. We were able to turn that into, all right, let's go out and get fully funded public schools. So this is a really big win. We have to now go out, and fight for it at the local level and make sure that when that money comes into districts, that it's educators and the community that are saying how that money is going to be spent, and that's our next level of organizing.
Well, finally, I wanted to ask you if you have any words of wisdom or solidarity for teachers and students here in the city of Rochester who are facing proposed mid-year cuts to at least 155 teaching positions. The superintendent has said the cuts here are necessary to recuperating what he says will be a $64 million budget gap caused by overspending on special ed, transportation, and charter tuition. However, advocacy groups here have said that New York State should be the one to foot the bill since legislators have repeatedly failed to provide schools with the equitable funding they committed to back in 2007. And according to one estimate, the state owes Rochester $86 million. Leadership of the teachers union says it's open to negotiations, but the district has not approached it with a proposal. Meanwhile, students and parents and teachers have been holding rallies. Students walked out at several high school and middle schools this week, some for multiple days in a row. The school board here in Rochester is set to vote on the proposed cuts on December 19th. So, Barbara Mataloni, as we wrap up here, what message do you have for teachers, students, and community members here in Rochester from Massachusetts?
Well, thank you for the opportunity to say so. I've been following what's going on in Rochester and send solidarity. But I also want to say it's really important to understand that you have the power. You have the power to shut things down and create so much disruption that the district has to go to the state and ask for that money. And don't let the district off the hook. It's their responsibility to go and get that money. And educators and students and the community, our power is our power to say we're not going to participate in this system if this system is unjust, and this is an injustice. So build your solidarity and look across the country and look at history, and it teaches us that, as I always say, like when we fight, we do win. And we may not win every battle, but we win because we come to understand ourselves as the one who actually control this. So be clear about where the power is. You have the power. The district needs to decide which side it's on. Are they going to be with you, or are they going to be with the austerity, scarcity-minded legislators? give them that choice. And we discovered that our districts oftentimes would come with us when we really forced their hand. But all power and solidarity to you.
All right, Barbara, thanks so very much. We're going to have to leave it there. Barbara Maddaloni is the former president of the Massachusetts Teachers Association. Her recent article in Labor Notes is entitled, Defying Injunction, Massachusetts Teachers Strike. Barbara, thanks so much again for your time.
Thank you very much.
So again, that was Darian Lehman from Reclaiming the Narrative with Barbara Maddaloni, a former head of the Massachusetts Teachers Union. You are listening to 100.9 FM at WXIR. This is Evidence of Design. We're talking about educational funding in the context of Darian talking about strikes, and we previously were talking about underfunding and how education is funded in general. This relates to the recession of 2008 when, wages have been stagnating since that time. Education has, in some cases, been funded even less. So I'm going to talk a little bit about as Darian mentioned, the Red for Ed strikes of 2018 and 2019 school year, where teachers across the nation went on strike. As Darian also mentioned in that clip that we just heard, in many states, teachers going on strike is actually illegal. So it, in some cases, can take legal action afterwards. Teachers, when they are going on strike, are putting themselves in a position where they could be arrested, they could be fined. So it is a very powerful move, and it usually comes after a long period of either negotiation or organizing. And it's not something that someone does on a whim. So I want to talk a little bit about the strikes that occurred over the 2018-2019 school year. So these strikes began in February of 2018 with discussions of strikes in West Virginia. Again, this wave is often called Red for Ed. This is kind of a nod to the strikes beginning in red or Republican-controlled states. In some cases, it's also a nod to the public school budgets being in the red.
I love puns.
It's good. And also, the teachers wore red. So when they were going to rallies or going to protests, they often wore red in this Red for Ed. In general, the reason for the strikes were low pay or wage cuts, cuts to pensions, and class sizes that had been slowly getting larger. As someone who's worked in education, I know it's a lot harder to manage a classroom that has 25 people in it versus a classroom of 18. Learning is better when it's a smaller group, obviously not too small, but when you have a reasonable sized group of students. And as classrooms get larger, it's harder for learning to happen. So that is a really important point. And obviously, wage cuts are important because you have to have a living wage if you're going to be in a classroom every day working with students. So those are the general reasons that people were going on strike. As we mentioned, related to the recession, many schools had not been spending any more on education since 2008. It's been 11 years now, so often as everything else increases, the public school funding should be increasing as well.
And it's worth, if I can jump in real quick,
Absolutely.
Mary, it's worth pointing out that red states, Republican-controlled states, tend to spend much less on education than bluer states. Mm-hmm. And Republican-controlled states also tend to have more austerity-minded measures. Of course, we live in a neoliberal world now where both Democrats and Republicans generally resort to austerity, meaning tighten up your belts, folks. We're doing budget cuts, and hold on to your hats because good luck. It's up to you. Government can't do anything here. Corporations will have to bail us out eventually, or something nonsensical like that, So in Republican-controlled states, you tend to have less money for education overall. Then the response to budget crises tends to be austerity more often than Democrat-controlled states too.
Yeah, that's a great point, especially even in that interview we were just listening to. They discussed Massachusetts as a blue state, which is a little bit different than the strikes that we're discussing, but they still have some common ground in, wage cuts and other issues that are shared from state to state throughout the nation. just a general timeline of how these strikes started. Again, they started in West Virginia when teachers were staging a walk-in and protested at the Virginia Capitol in early February of 2018. This inspired teachers from Oklahoma and Kentucky to strike in early April of 2018. In Oklahoma, it was actually the first teacher strike in the state since 1990. So that is really, really powerful to say. It's been over 25 years since the last strike, and yet they struck in April of 2018. In late April, teachers also struck out in Arizona and Colorado, and there was a bus driver strike in Georgia. In May, North Carolina teachers went on strike, and then going into the next part of the school year in January, or I guess the following school year, actually. In January, there were strikes in Los Angeles, California, and Virginia. In February, there were strikes in Oakland, California, and Denver, Colorado. In April, Sacramento, California. And in May, Union City, California, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Nashville, Tennessee. Now, some of these strikes are still in negotiation and haven't come to a standstill yet, but most of the strikes have been considered successful. Again, in that interview, we heard the sort of left perspective of there are no illegal strikes, only successful and unsuccessful strikes. Most of these strikes were successful where the teachers were able to win some of the claims that they had been fighting for. In Georgia, unfortunately, the bus driver strike it actually resulted in some people losing their jobs, and the strike in Kentucky also didn't come to any concessions. But all of the other strikes, and I just had a pretty long list of strikes that happened, most of them were successful and generally resulted in the teachers having salary raises, some agreed salary raises over the next few years, the class size reduction, and an increase in support staff. And those three things are really critical to smooth running of schools. Again, as a teacher or as someone who has been in a school teaching, having smaller class sizes makes it so much easier and so much healthier for the students to be actually in a good learning atmosphere. And having an increase in support staff, that's not just staff in the classroom, but also things like, with teacher aides and such, but that's also an additional special education, that's English language learning for students who may not be native to the United States or whose families aren't native or who aren't born here. And, things from reading and literacy, which are also really critical to students being successful later in life. So it's really amazing to see that all of these teacher strikes have been happening. And I think it was really inspiring to hear the teacher from Massachusetts discussing the strike in Massachusetts and hearing her words for what we can do or for what teachers can do around the country in face of wage cuts and other issues.
So we should probably try to wrap up the hour from here. We talked a lot this hour about educational funding. We mainly talked about four things on 100.9 FM WXIR. Our program is called Evidence of Design. At the start of the hour, I try to lay out a little bit of context for educational funding, where it all comes from, how complex the system is in general, according to Jason, you're messing up today. According to the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, around 47% of educational funding across the country, 47% of it comes from state governments. Again, there's 50 states, so there's essentially 50 different educational systems, and each state has its own state funding formulas. So the most of educational funding comes from state governments in general. 45% of educational funding comes from localities, and remember that is highly dependent on property taxes, and inequalities in the housing market directly transfer into inequalities in education. And lastly, only around 8% of educational funding comes from the federal government. And so most things come from state, then local, then federal. It's all tied together and all intermixed. Speaking of the state funding, in our second part of the hour, I talked about a report from the Alliance for Quality Education. You can find that online. It's called Foundation Aid in Name Only. That report details how, over the past decade, the New York State government hasn't really adhered to its own foundation aid formula. That's a state formula that it created after lawsuits as determined by our judicial branch for the state to adequately fund education according to what's in the New York State Constitution, which is a sound basic education. So according to the Alliance for Quality Education's report, New York State owes schools across the state $4 billion in foundation aid, and 67% of that $4 billion would go to districts where more than 50% of the students are black or brown. Mary, you talked about in the second half of the hour a report from Darian Lehman. He hosts Reclaim the Narrative, another show on WXIR that airs on Fridays at 12. And Darian was talking to someone from Massachusetts who was sort of an expert on teacher strikes that were going on there recently. And lastly, you just talked about teacher strikes around the country that happened last year, known as the Red for Ed. And that was particularly in the context of how after the Great Recession in 2008, educational spending and funding has essentially remained flat or actually lessened in many states. So the money that was being spent on education was like less in recent years than it was in even 2008. And a lot of the teachers and conditions in those states, particularly red states, just became untenable over time because of the austerity measures, and folks went on strike for that. But there were a lot of different reasons for the strikes, and it's hard to generalize them all.
Hard to generalize, but there are some common themes.
Mm-hmm. So in general, educational funding, I would say there's a lot to it, but it's helpful to be informed, of course, and I would encourage folks to keep in mind that it's hard to put a dollar value, a dollar amount on education, and that whatever it takes, in my opinion, to fund a student such that they can be successful is what's important to me. And we all live in a society where public education, I think, thankfully is mandated, and that's a good thing. Public institutions, I think, are a good thing. And I think it's a good thing to spend a lot of money on students' education so they can be successful.
Second that.
Yeah.
Thirded.
So, folks, you can find our past episodes for Evidence of Design on YouTube. You can search them specifically by searching for Evidence of Design Episode X. Type in anything between 1 and 75, and something will pop up for you if you want.
1 and 76 shortly.
Yep, today's the 76th episode of this show, and we're happy to be here. And thanks to WXIR for hosting great conversations and programs like this on a grassroots radio program in Rochester. That is unique. Not a lot of grassroots programs and radio shows left, thanks to corporatization. So here we are. Thanks for being here. Up next is the Esquire Hour. They put on a great show with Craig and John. We'll be back next Saturday, live for you, 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. here on 100.9 FM WXIR. I was your host, Jason Taylor, joined by my good friends and co-hosts, Matt Treadwell.
Goodbye.
And Mary Lawrence.
Have a great day.
Our intro and outro music is provided by Modest Mouse with a song called Dramamine. Be well, be safe, take care, and bye-bye.